who will speak to us about conversions, mass conversions, and the dynamics of cultural change in Spain of the three religions. Now we have visitors here, so I'll just say that Professor Nurnberg will speak for about 45 minutes to an hour, after which we will discuss for another hour, but we welcome comments before, right?
Yeah. And let me say that when we speak of co-productions, one co-production is the one between Uri and myself. That is to say, we've been thinking together for 10 years, or almost 10 years. So almost every word in that neighboring phase is in some way a co-production of conversations and of reading your work, etc. So your introduction means even more than introduction, like so generous introduction would normally mean to me. And thank you all. Thank you. I am going to try do something that is not prudent, and that is to try combine the kind of thinking about conversion in a very, very broad sense that we talked a little about yesterday and a little about in Tel Aviv, and then also talk specifically about the case of Spain in the mass conversions, because I think that one of the challenges that is greatest for us as historians is to think our problems large and to think them small, or rather particular, general and particular, to invoke Aristotle's invidious distinction. So I'd like to try to do both at once, and I don't know if I'll succeed. I might take only 10 minutes and then fold up my tent in disaster, or I might just speak for 6 hours like Fidel Castro, and then so let me begin by well, I called it setting the stage, and I think I called it setting the stage because I had in mind to use examples from theater. But let me begin with Paul, because we have spent so much time mentioning Paul, many of us, in the last couple of days, that it's always good to remind ourselves how much some of the categories of early Christian thought structure our thinking about conversion. And I just put randomly, well, no, not randomly, I did just select a few passages from Paul to give us a sense of how many different kinds of conversion we can talk about. So the first one, the letter kills but the Spirit gives life, immediately gives you a sense that all hermeneutics, once we're in a Pauline frame, can be thought of in terms of conversion. That is, in terms of a move from something we call the letter, literal, to something we call spirit, or, it's given many forms as this system thinks itself out. To set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the spirit is life and peace, is simply there to remind us that some kind of distinction between flesh and spirit can also be thought of as a conversion, so that in some sense all of our embodied experience as people with transcendent ideals, that is, as people in a kind of Christian system, can be thought of as a conversion. Now we are fully freed from the law, dead to that in which we lay captive. We can thus serve in the new being of the Spirit and not the old one of the letter. Well, that one brings them all together a little bit, but I put it there just to remind us that law and non-law, whatever that means, antinomianism, some imagination of freedom from law, can also be thought of as a conversion. And these are just a few of the many, I'm not going to call them dichotomies because they're not dichotomies, but they are potentials. There are ways of thinking about aspects of being that can be translated into the language of conversion. So the question is very large. And to give a sense of how large it is, I think we need to remind ourselves constantly that the cultures we study can think about themselves in terms of conversion from Judaism to Christianity, because all these categories get mapped onto Judaism, right? Law, letter, etc. Even when there are no issues with real Jews, living Jews, etc. in them. And I know I lugged this across the ocean for no good reason when I think of the greenhouse gases that were spent. But because it serves, and I think that's why I call this setting the stage, it serves for me as a constant reminder of how much work thinking about conversion can do in a culture that has no Jews of flesh within itself. What do I mean by thinking about conversion? I don't know if The Merchant of Venice is often thought about as a play about conversion, but in fact, every character in the play is hovering between Judaism and Christianity. From the very opening of the melancholy merchant, who doesn't know why he's so melancholy, but whose friends say to him, you're melancholy because you're a Pharisee, or you're melancholy because you're thinking too much about your money, or you're melancholy, he's immediately put into the situation of Jewishness. The same is true for our heroine, who finds herself in the very first scene also melancholic and also under what she calls the hand of a dead law, right? Her father's will is described as a dead law. So every character, Graziano, the character called Grace, right, himself is always hovering between Judaism and Christianity. In fact, he's the character who most often lapses into the position aligned with Judaism here. Most hilariously, when he sees Jessica cover herself with gold, gild herself with more ducats, she says, I shall gild myself with more ducats. In other words, confuse her body with material wealth. And he says, by my hood, a Gentile and no Jew. He swears by his foreskin that she is a Christian and not a Jew at the very moment that she's presenting herself as material wealth. And he, in this sense, you could say, he circumcises himself. It's not a joke that most of us get, but it's certainly a joke. So what I'm trying to say is that this is a play that is full of conversion. And why is it full of conversion? Not because it's concerned with conversos and real Jews in its midst, but because it's thinking about questions that have to do with law, contract, merchandise and money lending, and above all, well, no, I shouldn't say above all, but in addition, the art form of theater, that is the selling of words for money. Remember, the first ticket to a theatrical performance in England was sold in Shakespeare's day. This is a new commercial art form which is selling pretense for gold, or for silver, actually for the pale and common drudge twixt man and man, Shakespeare calls it. So it's not only Paul, and I just put Matthew's Pharisees up here to remind us of something that we too often forget, I think, which is that the category Jew, Christian, or Pharisee, or many of the, we can enter a discussion about what the relationship between all these words is, Jew, Pharisee, Israelite, etc. That the category does a huge amount of aesthetic work. And when I say we too often forget it, we know that religion is also about our aesthetics. Clifford Geertz famously put it in his definition of religion, that religion is a symbolic system that structures our aesthetics, our morals, our moods. But here you have an example of how a gospel text can compress all of that aesthetic potential. What looks fair on the outside and is foul within. What seems to be but is not, which is, after all, what ontology is all about, right? So all the ontological questions about appearance and being and truth in the world can be compressed into the figure of the Pharisee, which means that a huge amount of aesthetic experience can be thought of in terms of conversion. So far I'm just talking in general. That's what I mean by setting the stage, trying to say that the questions we are asking about conversion can be asked about almost any aspect of culture in Christian society, even though we tend to ask them most about, well, what we call real converts, or societies that have real converts. So the question that I'm just trying to adumbrate is that there is no human activity, or maybe I should pose it as a question, within a Christian frame, what human activity cannot be thought of in terms of conversion. And that's why yesterday I kind of just alluded to Derrida's line that the experience of language itself from his point of view, and speaking entirely again within a Pauline culture, is what he called an experience of circumcision, and well, he says with all appropriate cautions, but I don't know why we always want to put scare quotes around the word, an experience of Judaism. Now, let me try bring this a little into a local context and try give a sense for each category I'm going to talk about how conversion or Judaism works to think about an aesthetic sphere, and then how that aesthetic sphere is transformed by the experience of mass conversion. So, very generally. And poetry is the first sphere I'd like to talk about. I already began with poetry, although we can think of this as theater, it's also very much poetry. Let's just look at Castilian poetry, and just a little Castilian poetry, to give us a sense of how poetry itself is structured by some of these questions. So this is from Gonzalo de Berceo. So the first named poet in Castilian, and one of the great authors of what's called the art of the clergy, Mister de Clerecía, which is maybe the first great poetic genre in Castilian. And notice how he describes what his task is as a poet. This is from the introduction. Lords and friends, what I have said is an obscure word, a parable, we would say. We want to explain it. Let us throw away the shell and enter into the meat. Let's take what's inside and let's get rid of what's outside. So right away we're in the world of Matthew's Pharisees, in the sense that being or truth is expressed in terms of an outside and an inside, and the goal is to get into the spiritual inside. We're in the world of Christian letter versus spiritual meaning, or letter versus allegory. One of the anxieties, well, not anxieties, one of the plights of Christian poetry that's already explicit just in this description is that no matter how much Christian poetry says, we need to get to the inside, we need to get to the allegory, we need to get away from the letter and strip away the letter, it depends upon the letter. So this word, let us get to the marrow, the meat, the nut. What fleshier word is there than that? Even the way of expressing allegory is itself dependent upon flesh. Now this is, it may be an obvious point, that in a world of human language we always depend upon the letter. There is no escape from the letter. But for poets it's a particular problem, because, and if we had world enough and time, I could describe the long critiques of Christian poetry by Christian theologians. Poetry is not something that is unproblematic, precisely because it relies so much on external beauty. Thomas Aquinas, writing at much the same time as Gonzalo de Berceo, says, poetry never rises above the literal. In other words, it's a Jewish practice, right? So here you have a defense of poetry, a defense of poetry that's saying, no, we can read poetry allegorically. Dante will do the same thing, something similar. Theological poetics, we could call it. How does the book proceed? Well, those of you who've read The Miracles of Gonzalo de Berceo know that it proceeds by attacking Jews. It doesn't, not all the time, right? It's not every poem is about Jews. But it's amazing how many of the miracles do their work of distinguishing between the Christian way of living and the material way of living by setting up a contrast between Christian and Jew. And I don't want to go through all of them. I won't go through any of them. But I'll just say that already in the very earliest poetic manifesto in Castilian, the way in which poetry defends itself against the charge that it's too meaty, too literal, too dependent on the letter, is by attacking Jews, by projecting that meatiness onto Jews and saying, we Christian poets are not like that. We're Christian. If I were going to do a survey of Spanish poetry and show you how early poets are constantly dealing with this problem, I would then go to the Libro de Alejandro, the Book of Alexander, and show you how it begins by declaring that it brings a beautiful art that is not of the troubadours. It's an art without sin, mister sin pecado, which is of the clergy. And then it goes on to talk about its poetics, right? How it's going to do its rhyming. Now, how does the Libro de Alejandro do this work? Well, how many of you were at the Tel Aviv talk in which I talked about projective identification and so we could say that Gonzalo de Berceo tries to defend poetry by attacking Jews and showing that poetry is not Jewish. The Libro de Alejandro does almost the opposite, does what what I tried to show Quentin Massys did in his painting. It declares that the poet is in some way Jewish. And there's this amazing moment in the poem in which the poet's alter ego, an artist, Apelles of Kos, Apelles who in the poem paints the whole history of the empire, and who's described as a clérigo ben letrado, a cleric who is literate and he's the alter ego of the poet, is called Apelles Hebreus. He's called Apelles the Jew. So we might want to say that this form of poetry, just like I tried to hold up Jan van Eyck versus Quentin Massys, that here the Book of Alexander is saying, look, the poet is always wrestling with the Judaism of language, and it can never quite get away. And one of the things that's very interesting about the Libro de Alejandro is how it presents that itself as an experience of conversion. I don't know how many of you are fans of the history of Alexander the Great, but there's an important question. How did he die? We think he died by having a flower pot thrown on his head or something like this, but the medieval world thought he died of poison. In fact, Jonathan Swift in Gulliver's Travels has Gulliver asked the governor of Glovdubrid to summon Alexander to ask him how he died to resolve this question. That's how pressing a question it is. So in the Libro de Alexandro, he dies by poison. And he drinks this poisonous draught, and he immediately realizes he's been poisoned. And what does he do? He grabs a quill, so a feather, so the writing implement of the poet, and tries to use it to make himself vomit. But the quill too has been poisoned. Now, the way that the poem describes it is, Metio, the king put the quill in his, it doesn't say in his mouth, but he stuck it for love of conversion, for the love to turn around. The word is the same as convert. So you might say that here the poet is actually presenting the plight, if we want to take the quill as the poet's implement, as a plight of conversion. As you know, Alexander dies, and the poet ends with a moral, which is anyone who loves this world and the wisdom of this world and the beauty of this world will die like this. So it ends with a Christian moral, but at the same time having placed the poet into this Jewish position and placed the problem of poetry into one of conversion. My last example of poetry will be the Cantigas de Santa Maria by Alfonso X and his court. And the reason I want to use this is because I'm going to use it to actually talk about all the categories. I'm going to talk about poetry, a little bit about painting, a little bit about politics. The Cantigas is a pre-mass conversion text, right? So around the 1280s. And here you have already a project very similar to Gonzalo de Berceo's. Here you have a work of royal and courtly culture that is doing basically three things that are problematic. Well, four things that are problematic. Four things that are problematic. One is its poetry. So already it's going to have to defend itself as Christian poetry. More, it's poetry that claims to almost be liturgy. You'll see that Alfonso X deposits the Cantigas and has masses said using them as liturgy after he dies. So he treats his poetry as liturgy. He's making a huge claim for secular for secular poetry as religious vehicle. Second, it's painting. It's an illuminated manuscript, so it suffers all the challenges that painting suffers in a Christian world. I talked about those on Sunday in Tel Aviv, so I don't want to repeat them all, but it's going to have to defend itself against that. Third, it's a political text, and politics is also a mundane activity that falls under the sphere of law, that falls under the sphere of Judaism. So it's going to have to defend itself against that. Here you cannot see, because again, as always, you can't see the images I'm posting, but what you have here is one of the many cantigas that are about Jews. And the cantigas are full of Jews, and people often use them as ways of understanding Christian attitudes towards real Jews in Spain. There are real Jews in Spain, I'm not denying it. But the Jews are in the cantigas not only because there are real Jews, but because of the aesthetic problem that is faced by Alfonso X as a Christian poet, a Christian painter, a Christian, etc. So what is this particular cantiga? This particular cantiga 6 is one of the many cantigas that defend Christian poetry against the charge of Judaism. How do they do it? They do it by making the Jews the enemies of poetry. So this is the story of a young boy who learns to sing poems about the Virgin. And he sings them so beautifully that he offends the Jews, who hate to hear this. So that here you have a beautiful scene, which you cannot see, in which a Jew is hitting the young boy over the head with an axe. The young boy is then buried, miraculously sings, and the Jews are all burned. We know this story from, it has many forms in the Middle Ages, but one of the things we forget about the story is that the story serves as a way of presenting the poet as a victim of the Jews, as a martyr to Judaism, that is to say, as a figure of Jesus, in this case of the infant Jesus. The version in the cantigas is a version that in some way valorizes a kind of liturgical approach to poetry. And it's actually funny because, funny, it's not. The young poet is described as becoming a professional. He's so good that people pay him for his poetry. You know another version of this in a land that has no Jews, but it's also very important for poetry, and that is Chaucer's Prioress's Tale. And in the Prioress's Tale, again, the story is used to interrogate the status of poetry. I won't go into the why and the how, but it's used in a very different way than here. In the Prioress's Tale, the rote repetition of poetry is criticized rather than praised. And it's criticized as being about appearance rather than truth. So if you remember the prioress, she smiles beautifully, she is very elegant, she has beautiful breasts, but her morals are corrupt on the inside, right? So the outside and the inside don't correspond. And so Chaucer uses the Jew to make different claims about poetry than Alfonso does. And if this were a seminar about poetics and the Jew, we could talk about that. But all I'm trying to show here is how a poet in Spain, very much surrounded by real Jews, is also using figures of Judaism in order to defend his practice from the claims that it's a Judaizing practice. And those claims, by the way, are not theoretical. All of you who know a lot about medieval Spanish history know that Alfonso X was attacked as a Judaizer, that his bishops themselves, assembled in council, condemned him as a Judaizer and a lover of Jews, not only because of his poetry, especially, in fact, not so much because of his poetry, but because of other practices of his, which I won't have too much time to talk about. So Alfonso is actually making very strong claims about the power of Christian poetry, and here in Cantiga 70 you cannot see the strongest of those claims. This is a cantiga about the Annunciation, right? But you don't see the Archangel Gabriel here. You see Alfonso X with one of his poems. So the poet presents himself as, well, as a divine messenger almost. And here you see him touching the robe of the Virgin. Again, part of a defense of poetry that has two forms. On the one hand, it defends poetry as Christian. On the other hand, it presents poetry as opposed by Jews. let me talk a little bit about painting now, just as the second category. And this one I might dilate on, so we'll start with Spain and then move outward. Forgive me for moving back and forth from the particular and the contextual and the place with our real converts to the more general and the non-contextual, but I want to keep on making this point that that it's a problem that applies to all cultural forms, the problem of conversion. So the Cantigas also has to defend itself as a work of art against the claim that I tried to talk about in Tel Aviv about art as leading us towards Jewishness. And one of the ways in which it does so is, again, by posing the Jew as the enemy of the work of art, and therefore defending the work of art as Christian, as attacked by the Jews. And here you have a very famous Cantiga 34. It does this many different ways, and Jews are not the only enemies of art in the Cantigas. The devil is a great enemy of art in the Cantigas. In fact, there's a beautiful Cantiga about a painter who's painting an image of the devil, and he makes it so realistic and so ugly that the devil is furious and tries to make the painter fall. But the Virgin, from his scaffold, right? But the Virgin uses the painter's paintbrush to adhere him to the ceiling until his very implement of his art saves him. There are many such stories in the Cantigas about people criticizing poetry or painting and being opposed by God for criticizing it. Maybe the most beautiful one is about a poet troubadour who prays to the Virgin that if she's pleased by his song, candles will light when he plays and sings. And indeed, he sings to her a poem and the candles are lit. And a monk, so here you see the clerical attack on poetry, says, that's magic, and grabs the candle and extinguishes it. So the troubadour sings again, the candle lights again, until the people in the church overpower the monk, so to speak, and defend poetry. So you can, I'm not inventing the problem that these art forms face, and you can see how each of these defenses of them often takes the form of projection against Judaism. Here, the most beautiful projection you can see is how the opening frame, the image of the Virgin and Child, is stolen by the Jew, who will then dump it in a latrine as the devil takes him away. I would, I don't know if I could convince you of this, but I think in some ways the artists, the illuminators, are calling attention, special attention to the imageness here by hyperframing it, by putting the Jew in profile, by putting the image within multiple frames. So as to call attention to the work, to the opposition between art and Jew. Now what I try to suggest in Tel Aviv is that mass conversions do have an effect on how these general aesthetic problems are experienced. So in Tel Aviv I talked about a general critique of art as Judaizing and some general defenses. Here you have, this is yet another defense. A very interesting one that kind of brings together multiple forms of our question, flesh, empiricism, art, etc., and puts them into another miracle story. Here you have the king, who is, he seems to be dying of fever. He thinks he's dying. And he has a Jewish doctor. And we know he's a Jewish doctor because this hat is used throughout the manuscript to indicate Jews. And the Jewish doctor is giving instructions on how he should be cared for medically. He demands hot cloths, etc. The king is here saying no to the cure offered by the Jewish doctor and asks instead for the book of the Cantigas themselves, that is, this illuminated manuscript of poetry, to be brought to him. The book cures him, and the Jewish doctor is brought back to witness the cure, after which the Jewish doctor disappears, and you have the praise of the miracle. So here you have a similar, you might say, the ultimate defense of the work of art. The work of art created by the poet and his illuminators works a miracle of cure that is contravened or contraposed to the medicinal arts of the Jew. So what's the relationship between the real and the figural here? We know Alfonso X had Jewish doctors. We even know some of who they were. We know some of the manuscripts they created. We can actually imagine this as a scene that that really happened. At the same time, it's also caught up in a system of aesthetic differentiation that doesn't necessarily require the presence of real Jews, and we could watch it in debates elsewhere taking place without real Jews. So I'm trying just to insist on this kind of interrelationship between the figural and the real, which is not to say that changes in the real don't affect the work done by the figural. So we have the mass conversions of 1391, and those mass conversions do transform how people think about all of the domains I've just talked about, the domains of poetry, domains of painting. I don't know if this is the place to talk about how they transform the domain of poetry, but we don't have to talk about it. You can just go to the first great collection of Castilian poetry, the Cancionero de Baena. When I say collection, I mean the Cantigas is a great collection of Castilian poetry, but it's one manuscript created by one person, or one workshop. The Cancionero de Baena is a compilation of poems by many different poets. And one of the things that's very interesting about this compilation, which is undertaken roughly between 1391, the mass conversions, and the first quarter of the 15th century, and then presented to the king, is that of the hundreds of poems in this collection, hundreds of them talk about Judaism. The poets are constantly attacking each other as Jews. And one of the questions we've often asked, one of the questions criticism has often asked is why? And one of the answers criticism has often come up with is because the poets are converted Jews and they're attacking themselves as converted Jews. And yet, whenever we go to the archives and look for these poets, they turn out not to be converted Jews. They turn out to be old Christians, most of them. So the question then is, well, what work is the accusation of Judaism doing for these poets? And if, again, if this were a seminar on poetics, we could talk about how accusations of Judaism allow poets to debate the qualities of poetry and to contrast each other's merits as poets in a kind of competitive. What is it when rappers get up and counter rap? That's very much what's happening. They get up and insult each other as Jews in order to comment on each other's poetic skills. Something similar we saw happens with painting. And I'm hesitant to repeat things that I talked about in Tel Aviv, but I think there's actually not that much overlap in the audience, so I better repeat some. That one of the questions that the mass conversions brought up was about the relationship to images. And there's two ways of thinking about why the mass conversions created new anxiety about images. One way of thinking about why would be to say, okay, you have a whole bunch of Jews entering Christianity, and they bring with them Jewish ideas about images. So they bring with them an iconoclasm, an anti-image culture, and they then create an anti-image theology, which is not, it's kind of along the lines of the topics that Claude spoke about in his paper when he talked about what does a converso theology look like. Another way of thinking about images would be the migration of all these Jews into Christianity makes people very anxious about the difference between Christian and Jew, or how to establish Christianity when one of the primary foils for Christianity, which is Judaism, seems to be disappearing. So how does Christianity then articulate its Christianness if its chief foil is no longer seems so different? There's several ways of doing that. One would be to insist on increasing the distance between Christian and Jew. And that's exactly what happens in medieval Spain. After the mass conversions of 1391, you get the great segregatory efforts of Vincent Ferrer, attempts to kind of hyper-mark the Jews, hyper-isolate them, which lead to more conversions. But another way to try to re-establish the difference would be to create differences amongst Christians, and to say, you Christians are not fully Christian. You are acting Jewish. So the discourse of Judaizing gains new power from the mass conversions. It becomes useful in new ways. In poetry, it becomes useful in the way I just described. The poets start to use it against each other to create a system of criticizing poetry. And in painting, it becomes useful in new ways. And one of the ways it becomes useful, and here's where I talked about this painting in Tel Aviv, one of the ways it becomes useful is in order to make new claims to defend painting, and also new claims to differentiate between Christians. It may be the color settings on the projector. It doesn't seem to be a question of the light. I'm sorry. I won't talk much about this painting. Except just to insist on what you already know, that one of the claims it makes is that how you react to the image situates you either here amongst the faithful Christians, or here amongst a group of people, some of whom are marked as Jews. The Archysynagogus here is marked as a biblical Jew with ephod and everything. Here we have a kind of medieval Jew with a Jewish hat, but many of whom are not marked as Jews. They are, in fact, if this is Jan Hus, or they look Christian, they're in fact Christians with the inappropriate attitude towards the image, the Jewish attitude towards the image. So this image, which is painted in shortly after the mass conversions, and may have been painted as a commission from Spain, and may have been painted shortly after Jan van Eyck's visit to the Iberian Peninsula, seems to be yet another example of how art defends itself against the claim of its materialism, its beauty, its Judaism, and projects that claim outward. But one of the things it does show you is how the mass conversions have in some sense given art a new claim, a claim as diagnostic between Christian and Jew. So in a society in which there are really all kinds of new converts, in which some kinds of differences between Christian and Jew have disappeared, art gets a new role to articulate new differences. And I mentioned in Tel Aviv some of the literature we have from theologians defending art against Judaism, but also arguing that art is a requirement of Christianity, that having an appropriate relationship to the image is not just, so this is a defense of realism in art, right? And it pretends to be a defense against an anonymous treatise, which, again, we could think of as a converso treatise, but we needn't think of it as a converso treatise. We could just think of it as a Christian critique of realism in art, here being opposed by a bishop, who then, together with the Archbishop of Seville, issues an edict, which, I think has no parallel in the rest of Europe, that requires Christians to have art, devotional art, in their homes. At which point devotional art then becomes a kind of object that shows up all the time in Inquisition records as a way of differentiating between true Christian and false Christian. Or we could say true Christian and Jew, but we know they're not. We should not talk of the conversos as Jews. We should talk of them as Christians who are effectively Judaized within a discourse in Spanish society. So what I'm trying to describe here is how changes in, we might say, real Judaism, changes in converts in the flesh, transform the kind of work that aesthetic Judaism or figures of Judaism can do in a society. In this case, they transform how people think about what Christianity is. Christianity is a proper relationship to an image. Now, this is really a radically new thing. They transform how people think of conversion itself. Conversion requires devotion to image. Conversion is from iconoclasm to iconophilia, so to speak. And they transform how discriminations are made within society. But at the same time, these same questions don't go away in the rest of the European world, in a world without Jews, let's say, or without many real Jews. And I do want to just look outward a little bit from Spain to remind us that conversion remains a way of conversion from Judaism or relationship to Judaism remains a constant way in which all aesthetic practice has to occasionally think about itself. Damn, this is dark. This is called you can see nothing, so this is really unfortunate because I don't think words can affect. No, I don't think it's a question of the light. I think it's really a question of the color palette that either my computer or the projector is set for. But here you have Jesus, and here you have Levi Matthew in the act of conversion. And here you have a counter which divides them. And it's a very interesting painting because, well, again, in some ways this goes back to the Tel Aviv talk, because it's in some ways a defensive painting. It proposes to tell a story that's a biblical story. And here you have on a piece of paper, painted paper, that is framed as if it were a painting, but is actually a paper. You have the various biblical passages that tell the story of the conversion of Levi to becoming Matthew. One of the things is, and you have him in the act of conversion. He's removing his Jew's hat here. And he's converting from what? He's converting from all of this paper, which you cannot see, but it's a kind of trompe-l'oeil realism of paper just overflowing, the letter, and money, again, done in a beautiful realism, converting to the Christian side, which is in a totally different artistic style. In fact, in a very archaic style. This is more as if it were painted by Hans Memling than by Marinus van Reimersweiler, who painted this painting. So the thing is divided in two, with all of the artist's own particular style on the Jewish side. And you can see here I hope you can see some of the paper that he's, and one of the things, we know nothing about Marinus van Reimersweiler. We know very little, because very little about him survives. We don't even know much about Reimersweiler, the place he's from, except we can reconstruct everything written on the papers in his many paintings. People have done this. And they are actual tax records from Reimersweiler. In other words, the realism of the paper and the way in which it calls attention to worldliness is thoroughgoing. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that in this structure, you have again, painting, calling attention to the act of conversion, calling attention to you as viewer, and to the artist as embodied person caught between Judaism and Christianity, caught between the world and transcendent values, and not making it particularly easy to decide where you go. In fact, it's very hard to see where Matthew's going to go. How is he going to get out from behind the money counter? If you look, this is in some ways a very traditional, every aspect of these paintings has a long, long history. And so that divided counter that separates the Christian from the Jew, here you have it in an Italian painting from the 14th century. But you can see where he's going to exit here. Here it's easy. And you know what he's leaving. Again, notice the money, etc., on the money changes counter. But the challenge of conversion is made much greater in van Reimersweiler's painting. But it's a challenge we all are said to face. This is Caravaggio's Calling of St. Matthew, and again, I won't say much about it except just to usher in some of the same ways in which artists are playing with the system I'm trying to describe in order to put all viewers into the position of conversion. And great artists are often leaving it open whether such conversion is even possible, whether it's possible to escape the Jewishness of the object in this world as a Christian. So let me just give a quick reading of what's going on here. You know, people have famously pointed out that this arm is a citation from Michelangelo, etc. That's not, but what's very important here is that you cannot tell who's being called to convert. Who is this gesture toward? Many people would place the older figure as Matthew, as Levi being called to convert to Matthew. He himself seems to be in some doubt. He's pointing to himself as if, who, me? But this figure could just as easily be pointing here toward this figure who's looking down at the table covered with money. That is, making what I called in Tel Aviv the Jewish choice, still absorbed in the world. This figure here. So again, and trying to point to the ways in which all of these aesthetic forms are constantly playing with the question of the relationship to Judaism, even when, as in Caravaggio's world, unlike the Spanish world, conversion to Judaism is not a pressing issue. Now, I don't want to give the impression that all artists do this. Other artists can't bear that ambivalence. In Tel Aviv, I talked about at least 2 ways of dealing with the problem of Judaism and conversion. And here we can see a follower of Caravaggio, a Dutch follower of Caravaggio, also a follower, by the way, of Van Riemerswele. He seems to be citing Van Riemerswele's uses of paper, who can't stand the ambivalence of, you can see he's citing Caravaggio, but he can't bear not knowing who the convert is. And he has the convert point to himself. Let me skip all of this painting stuff and, yeah, because we said an hour, and get to the last part, which is politics. Politics, that is, being under law, we might say, is an activity we all in this world more or less have to be in. You already know from Paul just how problematic that activity is. Early readers of Galatians, for example, took Paul to be saying that we should not be under the law, right? Because he says a lot of things about the law in Galatians, and early readers took him to mean a kind of radical antinomian, some early readers. And we know this because in Romans he says, that's not what I meant. You are under the law. In this world, you can't, it doesn't mean you can do whatever you want, the fact that you are in Jesus. And we have lots of quotes like, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, etc. We know that early Christians had many different ways of thinking about the problem of, on the one hand, the ideal of not being under the law, and on the other hand, the necessity to be under the law. And one of the ways they had of dealing with it was thinking about the politics as a fairly Jewish practice. You know, for example, that Augustine places the earthly city under the sign of Cain, which is also the sign of the Jews, and he says, the end of politics is only fleshy. There is no spiritual end to politics. It's the realm of pure letter, you could say, pure law. Now that all has a future in the Middle Ages, and I don't have time to talk about that future, but it's a fascinating future. But one of the ways in which it presents itself is the way in which Christian politics in the Middle Ages very often has to work to differentiate itself from Judaism. And in the Cantigas, we also see that practice taking place. Remember that Alfonso X is someone who was attacked as having a Jewish politics, a Jewish tax politics, a Jewish politics of council, of putting Jews in positions of power over Christians, etc. How does and he writes, the Cantigas are illuminated at the very end of Alfonso's reign, when he's more or less imprisoned in Seville, restricted to Seville as part of a civil war waged by his son and the bishops and many of the nobles of the realm that have effectively overthrown him as a Jew lover. And in the Cantigas you see many ways in which he defends himself against this charge, including when he dies, presenting his persecutors as the Jews who have crucified Jesus, and presenting himself as having his head in the lap of the Virgin, like the crucified Jesus. Getting strangely emotional. But here you have a kind of illumination of the problem of the potential Jewishness of politics in the famous story of Theophilus. Theophilus is the privado, that is the counselor of a bishop. And so the question is how to be a good counselor, right? How to be a Christian counselor, a Christian politician, as opposed to being a Jewish politician. And I don't think I have a miniature, but you can see how here you have Theophilus on his knees before Is this a king? This is a king. He's wearing a crown. He's sitting on a throne before the tent of power with his power broker, the Jew. But of course, it's Satan. So we can immediately see two politics being contrasted: a Jewish, earthly, satanic politics, and a Christian non-Jewish politics, which Alfonso is trying to claim for his own, which every medieval monarch tries to claim for their own. Now, that doesn't go away with Alfonso's death. It doesn't go away with future Spanish kings. There's probably no Spanish king, either in Catalonia, Aragon, or in Castile, from Alfonso X to Ferdinand and Isabel, who is not accused at some point by some subject of being a Jew. And Ferdinand and Isabel, but they are. But this discourse is transformed by the mass conversions. Like the discourse of poetry, like the discourse of art, the migration of many Jews into Christianity, and the movement of those new Christians into some positions of governance. They're becoming privados, they're becoming counselors, they're becoming letrados, they're becoming administrators, not now stigmatized, but actually fully potent, creates a whole new potential for thinking about the Jewishness of politics. And again, what I want to stress is that this potential isn't necessarily linked to real Judaism or real converts. It existed already in all of the Christian societies, even many that didn't have Jews, like, for example, in England. But it is transformed or affected or given new ways of new form by real conversions. And it's in that context I want to just look at the first document, and I'll conclude with this. The first document that we associate with the laws of purity of blood, that is the documents created during the rebellion in 1449 in Toledo against the king for allegedly favoring the Jews, or not the Jews, favoring conversos, right? So we have protests against the king, and we have claims that the king's authority is Jewish and not Christian, and that therefore Toledo doesn't have to answer to the king. And I just want to remind us of how much those claims, of course we think of them as having to do with real converts. It's because real converts were really in positions of power, or real converts are doing real things. But I also want to remind us of how much it has to do with the material we looked at the very beginning, the kind of Pauline tools for thinking about the world. So let's just conclude by looking at my admittedly abbreviated and tortured translation of what is a very tortured introduction to the plea, the appeal of the bachelor Marcos García de Mora to the Pope. Well, to whom exactly is not clear, right? That's what's the point of this tortured introduction. I address this letter to the Holy Father, so that's the Pope, and to the high and powerful king or prince or administrator. Who has authority here? Who is the sovereign? To whom, according to God, law, reason, and right, there belongs the administration and governance of the realms of Castile, and to all other administrators in the spiritual and temporal affairs of the universal org, in the church militant, which is the congregation and university of faithful Christians, that is, those, so now we have a credo, those truly believing in the birth, passion, and resurrection, etc. So we have a kind of conditional address. I address this to whoever the administrator, the Pope, and whoever the administrator is, who truly believes. But I do not address it to those administrators who are the unbelieving and the doubtful in the faith, who are outside of us and in confederation with the synagogue, which is to say a congregation of beasts. For since such bind themselves like livestock to the letter, they have always given false meaning to divine and human scripture. I address this letter to those attesting to the truth and saying the letter kills, the spirit vivifies. But who is he addressing here? Who is he? He's not addressing the king, who's not a Jew, by the way, but here he's in confederation with the synagogue because he reads according to the letter. He's not even addressing the Pope. He says at the end of his letter, if the Pope rules against him, then the Pope too reads according to the letter and is in confederation with the synagogue. And then in that case he says, Toledo will place itself under the governance of the Holy Spirit. That is to say, the only administrator who truly does not read according to the letter. But you can see here the problem of this hermeneutics. It's not limited to conversos, to people with Jewish flesh, or to real Jews. It actually applies within a Pauline hermeneutic to any administrator who reads incorrectly, who reads according to the letter rather than to the spirit. So politics is, so to speak, always an act of conversion between letter and spirit. And it's an act which, I submit, every politician fails. Every politician is always too Jewish for this test. So even in a moment which we associate with the birth of racial Judaism in Europe, purity of blood, and it is a significant moment. It is a significant moment for biopolitics, but it's also a significant moment for hermeneutics of politics, or for political theology. And in that sense, we have to be open to the interplay between the figural and the flesh. And I guess with that, I'll just conclude and throw it open for debate.
Shall we take questions? You can.
Yeah. No. Please.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think this is one of the rare instances in which at least I've been exposed to perceptions of conversion rather than sheer terminologies, and really how a certain class, at least, perceived the idea of movement from one spiritual domain to another. And I'd like to thank you for that. I have a few questions. One is more on an informative basis, and that is, at what stage does money begin to show up as a marker of Judaism? I mean, letters, of course, we've seen that early on, but when does money begin to play a role? That's more out of my ignorance. And then, if I work along the lines of the dichotomy that you've created between spiritual and temporal, and I believe you classify the letter and the money belonging to the external, to the more temporal side. So, from what I gather through the examples you've given from poetry and painting, the emphasis is constantly on those external manifestations and less on the spiritual movement. So I mean, I don't know even if poetry and painting can portray that kind of movement, the spiritual movement. I don't know, but is that really a choice to emphasize those aspects of the spiritual movement on its temporal level? And finally, does this remain on a certain level of society? I mean, or does this understanding of conversion correlate in any way with how people who would listen to, say, or view these paintings or listen to sermons or read poetry, but they cannot read it, actually, they have to listen to it because they're illiterate and they're the masses. Does this correlate in any way with, or is there any way of finding out whether this correlates with more popular notions of conversion of those who move to the Christian side? So is there any way of finding out at all? Those are my questions.
Well, first I should say that I didn't create a dichotomy between spirit and matter. I'm trying to reflect a dichotomy that's present in Scripture but we don't need to think of it necessarily as a dichotomy. We can also think of it as interpenetrated in Scripture, which takes me to your first question. Money, and when does it get associated with what? And Scripture is constantly talking about money. I mean, the New Testament is constantly talking about money, and sometimes it very much says, place not your treasure on earth where worm and rust will, but place your treasure in heaven. So you might see that as it's a fiscal metaphor, and it's aiming to make fiscality transcendent. But it can't avoid using a fiscal metaphor of value. That is, money is the earthly way in which we think of value, and so parables are constantly telling us about money, the wages of the workers in the vineyard, etc., etc. So there's this double move in the founding text, so to speak, that they cannot do without. Just like the double move in poetry, they can't do without the language of material things, but they also stigmatize material things. And already in those texts, precisely because of that alignment, you start to see, and Judas's pieces of silver are a great example, how making the wrong choice is understood in Jewish terms. I cited that poem by George Herbert in Tel Aviv, in which he says, "He who chooses gold over his soul has made the Jewish choice." And Judas becomes a very powerful symbol for that choice, but by no means the only. So it's a very, you could say that the association of the sphere of economic value with the wrong choice, with the Pharisaic choice, with the Judas choice, or with the Jewish choice, is already a potential in Scripture, and that early Christian communities certainly develop it. The last part of your question, it's interesting. It really depends for what place and time you're talking about, what we can say about what you call the masses. One of the things I like about my world, the archive, the Crown of Aragon, which is the corner of the world I know best, is that so if in Spain, in Castile, you can see what Vincent Ferrer says, but you can't see what people do or think in response to what he says. In the Crown of Aragon, you have letters in the archive describing what people did in response to Vincent's preaching. So often you can show, to some degree, the Inquisition archives, of course, opened that up vastly, in that they contain a huge amount of material from people we associate with lower orders of society, both their views about converts, but also their own blasphemies, their own views about God, etc. So there are ways of doing that. I touched upon it when I didn't touch upon it today, but I touched upon it in Tel Aviv when I talked about Inquisition material about attitudes towards images. And there you see, for example, witnesses like servants saying, my mistress did this, and that implies this, right? Now, how do they know this? Well, they probably learn it from hearing sermons from inquisitors who say, as we know they said, if you see this, it means this. If you see this, it means that. If you see this, it means this. So there is a process of communication of this logic and of these new forms of that logic that is constant and ongoing. Yeah.
As you are speaking about Spain, a place of three cultures, I wonder where are the Muslims in this worldview? Do they have the same place as the Jews? Are they at all? Do they at all appear in the paintings and in the poetry? And if they do, in the same way as an inner enemy of the Christians, or of some? Are they at all there?
Yeah, I mean, this is a problem, and it's a problem that, in Neighboring Faiths, I try sometimes to hold all three together, but sometimes you can't. You can't say everything in one sermon, and you can't hold all variables in play sometimes. But certainly we have lots of representations which we could use to ask this question. For example, there's a Catalan readable from the 14th century, which I have on my computer, but not in this PowerPoint, so I won't try to show it, which shows you, well, it's 3 scenes. One of the scenes is the Jews desecrating a host. The next scene is a prostitute lying with a Muslim. And the third scene is the Eucharist slitting the prostitute's throat. Well, we don't know if she's a prostitute, a Christian woman lying with a Muslim. And the third scene, it's slitting the woman's throat. The Eucharist is slitting the woman's throat. So you could argue that here you see 3 very different, well, you see 2 very different dangers represented, right? And I think that's the kind of sorting we have to do constantly. We have to, the Islam and the Muslim and Judaism and the Jew do very different kinds of work in the society, but sometimes they're brought explicitly together. So for example, Vincent Ferrer, he preaches in many cities about both Judaism and Islam. So he will preach, for example, in a city that many of you Christian men think that your child is yours, but in fact it's a Muslim, because your wife has slept with a Muslim man. And we know from letters to the kind of Aragon archive, to the king, that people reacted to that they formed posses to patrol the town at night, to look out for Muslim men on the prowl for Christian women. But we also know that all the segregatory legislation that was passed and all the segregation that was actually implemented aimed only at Jews. So, you know, we have to, even when both are brought together, we can see that the anxieties are quite different. The sexual anxiety is very strongly aligned initially, well, at certain times with Muslims. Although immediately after 1391, when all of a sudden it seems like all these Christians have all these Jews have become Christian, and it's much harder to tell the difference between Christian and Jew, you see, for example, the King John I of Aragon issuing all kinds of new edicts about the need to kill any Jew who has sex with a Christian, and new edicts about the need to hypermark Jews so that they don't have sex with Christians. So you can actually, over time, you can create a kind of I don't know, pressure wave of anxieties and map it onto different religious categories. But that is what you would have to do to really, for example, in Neighboring Faiths, I try to do that with sex. I try to show how, depending very much on shifting theological work, shifting sociological anxieties amongst Christians, the role of a Muslim or a Jew changes. But in general, I would say that on the aesthetic categories, which I focus more on today, you could probably do similar work. I would invoke here Felipe Pereda's work on how the conversion of Muslims, so later, affects changes in Christian art in Spain. But equally, you would point earlier to the conversion of Jews and the changes in Christian art that mobilized. So you can show both. Certainly there is Christian art addressed to Morisco audiences that does specific kinds of work, and you could probably do this kind of project on that kind of art. Similarly with poetry, you have lots of attempts to defend poetry from Judaism, often to perform poetry as Judaizing. You also have attempts to purify poetry from Arabic. So we have poets like Juan de Mina, and we call them sometimes Latinizing poets, who try very hard to purge their vocabulary of loan words from Arabic. So you could show, it's a pretty minor strand, but you could show concomitant anxieties about Islam. But it's that kind of project you'd have to do, and it's a little, yeah, it's a big job.
Yes, I would just like to add the scene you showed before that with the king lying in bed sick and the Jewish doctor treating him. It reminded me, for some reason, of Pietro da Eboli, who has also a very beautiful miniature design and everything, with King William II of Sicily lying in bed and a Muslim doctor treating him.
Yeah.
He's clearly a Muslim because he has the turban and the astrolabe and everything. And on the other hand, there are also Jews in the city.
Yeah.
Among the peoples of Palermo. So I don't know if he means that the Muslim doctor didn't treat him well, or maybe he should have prayed instead of being treated by a Muslim doctor, I don't know. But this motive of the non-Christian doctor treating the king is something that maybe is more prevalent than just in the Contigas.
Sure. It's an important question. And Pietro de Eboli, one of the differences though is that Pietro de Eboli doesn't stigmatize the treatment,
No.
whereas the Cantiga does, and that's a curious thing. That's all I'm calling attention to. The motif of the Jewish or the Muslim doctor not so much in Spain of the 13th and 14th centuries. Muslim veterinarian, very common, but not so much Muslim doctor. Muslim eye surgeon, quite common, but not so much Muslim doctor. That motif is also common. And if I talked about the lapidario, for example, and shown you the cover image of the lapidario, you would have seen a kind of totally unproblematic image, also by Alfonso X's workshop, of Alfonso X with a Jewish doctor giving him this new translation of an Arabic manuscript. So it really very much depends on the context. But one of the things that's curious is how medicine in general, we know people are constantly practicing medicine. Medicine is highly valued, and yet it's also often stigmatized, and in particular empirical medicine has to defend itself against this charge, the charge of Judaism, and we see Christian doctors in academic disputes over whether physic or empiricism is the proper, Galenism or empiricism is the proper approach, accusing each other of being Pharisees. So I think again, it's not so much a question of whether Islam or Judaism or this context or that context. It's very much a question of seeing what anxiety or what issue is being staged in a given context, and that not all contexts are the same. One of the very curious things about Alfonso X is how Alfonso X is the great translator of all kinds of scientific texts, astronomical, medical, mathematical, and often with no anxiety. He even has deeply skeptical texts, like the Kalila, Wadimna, etc., with no anxiety. And yet, in the Cantigas, he stages a very different project in which he's clearly working very hard to defend himself from the charge of Judaism, which we know he's also being attacked with at that time. So I'd say again, it's not a constant, it's a potential. I'm not trying to claim that these issues are always there. Well, the potential is always there, and the potential to put this structure to new kinds of work. Yeah.
So the focus of this presentation is really the perception of conversion, the notions that people harbor in their heads and so on. And I'm wondering, did you try, or how would you go about connecting this to concrete historical instances, whether it's cases or individuals? Because at this point it's sort of like historically a bit vague for me at least, and I want to understand how you would bring it down to concrete cases that would influence these perceptions, that would influence these notions. So
that's totally fair, and that's actually what I mostly do. But it's hard to do both things at once. So, for example, I can show you how after 1391 there's a spike in concern about sex between Christian and Jew, and there's this move to hypermark the Jew. And I can show you that in terms of legislation, and in fact, at some point, the Queen even intervenes and says, "Stop it! You can't make the badge any bigger. It's already." And I can then show you actual cases. Mm-hmm. I can show you that Saltet Garcia is arrested for dressing as a Christian and having sex with Christian women. And I can try to show you a concrete case that triggers this we might say, hyperreaction. Or similarly, I can show you how converts talk about the availability of new kinds of opportunities. We have a beautiful letter that one convert writes to another, exhorting him to convert and saying, all of us emerge from the fountain with peacock and dwarf, meaning with birds of high value and court dwarves because we become important politicians. So I can show you how different sides represent them. I can show you poems in which Jaume Roig complains about his girlfriend going to another man who's a converso and letting herself be penetrated by his hatless rod. I can show you how these differences become part of sexual invective amongst courtiers. I can show you all kinds of details about what we would call the real. That's what I have my 6,000 documents for. But at the same time, what I'm trying to say, and I think it's very easy for us to forget, is that you can't separate that real, what we call the real, those documents, those cases, from the system of thought within which it's functioning, and that we have to move back and forth. That's why I try to move from the very general to Spain, where I have my 6,000 cases, to. But yes, there might be a better way to structure this talk, which would be to focus, for example, just on the case of one woman accused of looking at an image the wrong way, or one, that would be another way to do it.
Yeah, well, I have so many comments that my comments would be indeed one of Fidel Castro's. Let me only speak about two things regarding the theological position of Jews and Muslims. I would suggest that while Jews are seen in this perspective, and you gave very, very convincing examples as inner parts of Christian theological political discourses, Muslims tends to be perceived as contiguous parts of that. And that is why while Jews living in Christian countries from time to time were accused to be conspirators, Muslims, when they turn to live within Christian countries, they tend to be perceived as fifth columns. And I think that we can here identify some distinctive typological basic perceptions, even, of course, permeated in history. But my main commentary was to propose another complementary paradigm that yours. Your paradigm was more or less top and bottom paradigm, while on the top is Christianity, the bottom basically is Jewishness, spirit and flesh. And this is a kind of Neoplatonic paradigm. But I am suggesting a kind of Aristotelian paradigm that is taking into account left and right. I mean that let me clarify, giving a brief example. Giacomo Todeschini's last works on Jewish money lending in the Middle Ages, he claimed that basically Christian society, or at least the establishment, was not against money lending, that they were against what they perceived money who is employed not to increase the common good, but to increase personal interest. Then the Jewish money lenders were often accused to lend money not to increase the common good, but to increase their own fortune, while the Fuggers or other bankers, Christian bankers, money lenders to popes, and that, they were perceived in a very positive ways as contributing to the summum bonum. And this makes me to arrive to my point. And here again in a theological political key, I will suggest the theological political term glory, gloria. That is the idea that not everything that is body, flesh, money, it's, from a Christian point of view, negative. Insofar it glorifies God. Insofar it is only adding God's presence and celebration in this world. And this, of course, turned to be more tangible when it's embedded with Aristotelian Christianism or Christian Aristotelism. Take the example of Thomas of Aquinas and others, when they more and more they say not against this Augustinian claim, not everything that has to do with state, with power, with money, but is negative. You can address it to the proper ways. And this is what I wanted to say, that this of course complicates a lot the place of Jews and Judaicity, and it explains also people who in the name of this perception of glorified God, Ignatius of Loyola motto, they also endorsed Christian philosemitism. They said, okay, conversos, because they are sometimes associated with carnality, they can add glory and splendor to the world.
Yeah, first the Muslims, I'm happy to accept your description, since, and anyway, it's not part of my discussion today, but you could also just simply give a simpler reason for the dichotomy between co-conspirator and fifth columnist, which is one often given by contemporaries themselves, which is the observation, as every king of Aragon made, Muslims have kingdoms and Jews don't. Yes. But the broader point, you know, I agree entirely, and in all the kind of political theological work I would do, I would stress the Aristotelian concepts of tyranny and of good governance that are percolating through Castile in the 13th and 14th century, not so much through Thomas Aquinas, but through Giles of Rome and these kinds of mayors of princes. And there's no doubt that, and anyway, just the incarnational paradigm, the flesh need not be understood as stigmatized. Well, I mean, it need not be, and often it isn't. What none of these systems, no matter how Aristotelianized they become, can get away from is a vulnerability of every claim that matter is proclaiming the glory of God to the claim that it's actually misleading from the glory of God. And in this system, there is no way, no Aristotelian golden arrow that can insulate any politics, although politicians are constantly making Aristotelian claims to be governing. But even Aristotle says that the ideal governance is the governance for the soul, just as it's right, he says, for the soul to govern over the body. And so he also creates the analogy which Christian Aristotelians constantly use, which does hierarchicalize the relationship. And so precisely because of this, there is no escaping the potential. And again, I'm not arguing that the flesh or money or art is always stigmatized. Obviously it isn't. I'm arguing that it always has the potential to be stigmatized, and that in all of these societies, at any given moment, somebody is doing that. Somebody is, yes, proclaiming the glory of Ferdinand and Isabel. Somebody else is calling them Jews. Somebody is proclaiming that art, and usually a majority, that art leads towards God, or that a given work of art leads towards God, and somebody else is saying, no, it doesn't. And we can't forget that within this system, we all want to fantasize we can forget it. Many people argue, no, the incarnation solved the problem. Lots of people have argued this. The incarnation made flesh, it redeemed the flesh, and it brought the God into the world. The problem is that it also created this always potential stigmatization of the worldly in terms of Judaism. And no amount of Aristotelianism can make that go away. Yeah.
Shelat Tam, it's a question of ignorance, because I don't work on conversion at all, and I haven't been to other meetings, so it's probably obvious to everybody in this room. Just when you were setting the stage, what struck me is in all these scriptural quotes was the motif of death and life that appeared in all of them. And the moment I saw that, and it's in the first slide, then it began reoccurring throughout your talk along the way at different moments. Even the image of the dying doctor, or Alexander who thinks he's dying, and then the turn around is trying to redeem himself back into life. And of course, this is kind of a guiding metaphor for conversion of death and life, and the founding moment of Christianity in many ways, the death that turns into life, which in a way seems to strengthen the thesis and even broadens it even further, takes it away from the particular in maybe a troubling way, that it becomes omnipresent, just as you can't escape language and everything you're saying. Language is everywhere there. Also, life and death is everywhere there. So it's again a potential, which means these issues are always around us and can be activated in different forms. So it just seemed to me to be hovering in the background here, though never quite identified as such.
Absolutely. And another way of putting it would be to say that the difference between the eternal, and this is, a philosophical distinction from the earliest days, and the transient, or the pathetic, what suffers change, and the apathetic, what doesn't, is one of the things that's at stake. And that the ideal of transcendence is this ideal that by orienting ourselves to the transcendent, we can become apathetic, immortal, right? Our soul will become. So that's very much part of the system. And I think that's part of the system even before Christianity. It's part of the problem that Plato or Aristotle are thinking about in different ways. In the medieval period, we could also find the same debate. For example, Nachmanides has a very, the Holy Letter is a good, if we want to attribute it to Nachmanides, is a good example of this debate about, who has it right. In terms of what the flesh is. So we could find this debate everywhere. But my point here is that even before Christianity, I think you're right, that those are very basic categories. And the question for in all of these moments is, where is your attention being oriented? Is it being oriented towards the eternal or towards the transient? Yeah, yes.
I was wondering if you could elaborate, if you have any ideas. I mean, your starting point is this kind of tension matrix of illusions between Christian and Jewish as they start with Paul and onwards, formulate in the early Middle Ages into the formative ideas of the church. But later on in the 12th, 13th, and 14th century, these images are going within themselves, within theology. Dramatic changes and different dispositions are being taken. I mean, if we look specifically to the core of this issue, the hermeneutics, of biblical hermeneutics, the emergence of the beginning of the emergence of a new division of literal and spiritual senses, and then their complete collapse starting from the 14th century and surely in the 15th century. Which brings me to your last example. I mean, this kind of language is being used throughout ecclesiastical discussions regarding both ecclesiastical turmoils and political turmoils, and so there's this complete meltdown of the separation between the senses after the late 14th century and onwards. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts, any ideas how these theological transformations, biblical hermeneutic transformations, are still feeding new images of Jewishness within these other realms, or we're just talking about something that is much more fundamental and is not sensitive to new theological ideas that evolve in the universities and in mendicant orders. And of course, if you follow your line, how do you take it that this new need to address the problem of conversos, of these Jews that are transforming, is playing within the general question of biblical hermeneutics in the 15th century, which again completely collapsed. This is at least how historians, trying to find the way to the Reformation are describing it.
Right.
So how do you see the two interplays?
Well, I think that's really your field. I mean, I have focused mostly in my own reading, and theological reading, on the theology of baptism and on the debates around that theology around 1449, because one can show vast theological change, or at least vast theological disagreement on specific questions of doctrine. For example, of baptism involving specifically the conversos. So, and so one way to approach your question would be to focus on specific aspects of it. And in that sense, a treatise like Alonso de Cartagena's on the unity of the Christian faith is a beautiful example of how hermeneutics and biblical criticism and new philology are all brought to bear specifically on the question of converts, and specifically these converts. I've often asked myself, but it's far beyond my competence, it's smack in the middle of yours, how the specific practices, hermeneutic practices of a Pablo, for example, affect the pool of thinking for Christian hermeneutics in general, especially once you have the conjoining with Nicholas of Lyra, etc., into a kind of basic commentary forms. How that affects, for example, the psalm commentaries of a Jaime Pérez de Valencia, or how Jaime Pérez de Valencia and those kinds of psalm commentaries contribute to the kind of literalizing reading of a Martin Luther, and to what degree that reading is itself seeking to distance itself from claims of being Jewish. Those are questions that are really important, but they're too big for me at the moment.
Thank you very much for really such a beautiful talk. First of all, I would like to walk a bit along those lines. Also, you addressed at the beginning of your talk the importance of addressing the wider question, and did you describe conversion in its civilizational scope, and in the most fascinating and illuminating way. And one cannot help wonder where does it go from there on. And you described the period you described as more or less the later Middle Ages, approaching Renaissance, etc. And you described the value system, which is definitely very Middle Ages value system, which we know it changes. Like he proposed in the lines of hermeneutics, but other lines also in the following centuries. Now the question is, if we go along those fascinating lines of like conversion, especially in the Carolingian and more the historical lines, does it mean that modernization, whatever comes later, is all about Judaization, like Marx, for example, proposes is on the Jewish question? The Christian world went to Judaism, being Judaized, or Werner Sombart later, or others even more recently. I'm not sure these questions are. It's very possible to answer a strict answer, but these are definitely fascinating questions. Or are there other lines within Christian frameworks, maybe Weberian lines or post-Weberian lines, which relates to other dynamics within Christian world itself? That's
well, I mean, you know, these are questions that really want the thing to go from the beginning of time and creativity to the present, and you're absolutely right. And I think I'd give two answers. One is that some of this I tried to do in Tel Aviv. I tried to show, for example, how the attitudes towards art that I present here as medieval early modern, and I could have run them through Protestantism easily enough. Well, Quentin Massis is in that world, and Van Reimerswele as well. Continue in the modern world. So different form, different. One might want to invoke other aspects of the question, but I tried to show how in the 20th century, the ways in which the challenge of art was being imagined, both by certain avant-gardes, from the Cubists to Matisse, and by their enemies. For example, the advocates of a German national art in the mid-30s are explicitly drawing the same kinds of distinctions about what art should do and about the danger of the senses, etc., that I can show are important for this moment of the discovery of art, so-called, in the 15th century. So one could do it for discrete fields. I have a constant maybe, it's not explicit, but one could say an Auseinandersetzung with colleagues like my beloved colleague Robert Pippin, for whom Hegel is the beginning of modern thought. Whereas for me, I'm much more interested in the way in which Hegel turns many of these kinds of distinctions into things that become critical thought, but he doesn't transcend them. So Weber, Sombart, and Marx are all part of that question for me. That is, how theological structures become secular structures, so to speak. And in that sense, I would entirely agree with you about Marx and what he's doing. And also, well, I wrote about this in Anti-Judaism. I wrote about all the figures you just mentioned. Not because I think that they're doing the same thing as the Christian Middle Ages or Luther or did, but because they are working with some of the same basic challenges, hierarchies, concepts, and transforming them for a new concept, a new world, but not escaping them. So in that sense, I would draw this story forward, yes, absolutely, to the present. And if I were speaking explicitly about art history, I would talk about the resacralization, not only of the image, but also of discourse about the image. One could point to a number of sculptors and artists and painters like Beuys in Germany, or critics like Yves Bonfoy. And one could even talk about the discourse, the art historical discourse of presence and grace, etc., which is very important. Michael Fried, Art and Objecthood, very important to how we think about modern art as, in some way, part of this history. So I would carry it forward, yes.
I'm going to want to push us back again into the Middle Ages and to go back a little to Ora's question to you before, and try and push it slightly further with regard to the image of the Muslim within the aesthetical picture you were trying to show to us, because what we've heard also from the questions and also from the way you presented it, it's a very binary, in a way, it's a very binary presentation. Right? Letter, the spirit, life, death, flesh, and spirit again, or whatever. But and there you find quite easily, I think, the Jew and the. I'm very convinced, and I like the way you presented the way you present the place of the Jew, who's not necessarily a Jew, but it's a way of thinking about these binaries. But for example, in the Cantigas, there are plenty of places, I think, right, where we have Jews, Muslims, and Christians together. Right? Or Muslims and Christians, or Jews and Muslims, and using the Cantigas as an example, where do the Muslims actually fit into those aesthetics? Is there a third leg that the Muslims fulfill, not as Muslims who are a living presence in Castile, but as a sort of, do they fulfill also some sort of aesthetic purpose?
Yeah. So, well, first a general word about binaries. It seems as if the human sciences went through a period in which we loved binaries, and then they went through a period in which they abhor binaries. And I am not imposing. I'm not imposing a structuralism. I'm not. On the contrary. In fact, I think the highest compliment that, again, my colleague Robert Pippin ever gave me was when he said that my work was quite Hegelian. I mean, and I'm not opposed to structuralism, but I do think we should not neglect the categories that our sources have given us. And it's not I who have created what the Stoics called, I think, stoicheia, and which Paul deploys everywhere. That is, list of opposites. And it's not I who said, as St. Augustine said, that God created everything in twos. So we neglect at our peril the fact that many of our sources have themselves thought the world in twos or threes or sevens or whatever, right? The Book of Three, the Talmud often has three things come unexpected, right? A found object, a scorpion, and the Messiah. And the category of threes is very important. The Book of Three is a nice Catalan book. 3 kinds of water are wasted. Water added to wine, water for washing an ugly woman, water for baptizing an old Jew. There's lots of great threes. But my point is that we should not stigmatize binaries because they're binaries. We should only ask ourselves what kind of work they were doing in the cultures we're studying. And even those cultures, they may have had 2 categories, letter, spirit, but they may also have thought about the relationship in very Aristotelian terms, or in very incarnational terms, or in very dialectical terms. So we need to be aware both of the categories, which may be dual, and of their flexibility. And I don't think I'm imposing or being binary or dichotomous. I just think that I'm trying to take seriously some terms that our sources took seriously. Both Paul took seriously, and the Bachiller Garcia, Marcos Garcia de Mora took seriously. But your question about Muslims, it would be it would be a fascinating project to show. And I mentioned that art has many adversaries in the Cantigas. I mentioned the devil, and I mentioned the Jews. I forgot to mention the Muslims. Muslims are adversaries of art in the Cantigas. They are iconoclasts. They're also easily converted by art. So you have Muslims who convert to an image of the Virgin, the lactating Virgin, etc. So there are many examples of the Muslim in relation to the image within the Cantigas. And we could, and some people have, Bagby and others, Mercedes Garcia Renal, have tried to relate that to real attitudes towards Muslims and differentiate attitudes from Muslims towards attitudes from Jews, etc. And that's all possible. At the same time, we could also take seriously the possibility that, and I'm not saying that Mercedes doesn't, but we should take seriously that that the Muslim is also what Brian Speech calls a hermeneutic Muslim, and that Muslim is very often functioning and created, co-produced, to use a word that Uri and I sometimes used, with the Jew. It's not an accident that many of the ways in which Christians think about Islam are as forms of Judaism, or as heresies of Judaism, or as borrowings from Judaism. And this is a discursive move that explodes with the mass conversions. So, in fact, one of the things you start to see after the mass conversions, both amongst Jewish writers, converso writers, and old Christian writers, trying to argue about the history of their religions as a tool in conflict amongst themselves, is this attempt to map Christian practices onto Jewish practices, Muslim practices onto Jewish practices. So Jewish writers defending Judaism will say, well, your baptism is just a form of art. And against Islam, the constant critique that all of Islam's central beliefs are borrowings from Judaism or Islam or Christianity, depending on who's doing the arguing. So you will find theologians defending Muslim conversion, Jewish conversion to Islam, and condemning Muslim conversion to Judaism by trying to show that Islamic practice, although similar to Jewish practice, is closer to Christian practice. And you will find, conversely, people trying to defend the practice of converting Muslims to Judaism, this is in Neighboring Faiths, by talking about how Judaism is closer to Christian practice and Islam is a perversion away from. So you can see all these positions, but all of them tend to proceed from an assumption that historicity, and in the sense that antiquity, that Judaism came first and that we know what Judaism is, Christianity came second, it's a supersession and a truth, and Islam is in some way, and this is true both for in some way related to those other two, either by further error or by further truth. Even with the expulsion of the Moriscos, you get the argument that they are heretics, Judaizing heretics. And you even find Moriscos being accused of Judaizing before the Inquisition. As the Inquisition, for 2 reasons. One is that Moriscos, looking for practices that will differentiate them from Christianity, to resist Christianity, pick up practices that are actually Jewish, like lighting candles on Sabbath, and then get indicted for Judaism. But another reason is that Christianity, trying to categorize heresy, as already the Panarion of Epiphanius the Psalmist had done, trace almost every heresy to a form of Judaism. So it's not that Islam is in any way independent of thinking about Judaism in this world.
Can I just follow that? I'm sorry. Can I just follow that up for 1 second? I think your answer is fascinating because it might help explain why, within the polemical works written against Islam by Christians, at least from the mid-12th century onwards, and even in places where it's obvious that they know Islam very well,
right?
They portray Islam in a way which is totally different from real Islam, and brings it, I think, closer in a way to Judaism, right? And so you find that Islam is described as something which it totally isn't, even when you know that these people have traveled among Muslims and know, and I mean Tom Berman has shown that very well in his work, and other people, and I think that goes a long way to explaining it in a way. Well, it goes some way to explain it.
Yeah, no, I think just a last comment on this is at this moment, 1391 forward, or even the 14th century, 15th century in general, with these three faiths in Spain, is a fascinating moment in the history of comparative religion. And one thing I'd like to do someday, if God gives me time and strength, is to look at for example, the Taqyid al-Millah, these Arabic polemics against Judaism from 14th century, Crown of Aragon probably, Muslims living in under Christian rule, how they turn to the history of religion to try articulate the relationship between the three religions, just as we see Jewish writers doing after the mass conversions, and we see, for example, Alonso de Cartagena doing in 1449. This energizes a whole new approach to the past, and I think that we need to understand that approach in order to understand the history of religion.
No, I will say regarding your argument, putting it in a pleasant way, I will say that like Trinity, like Spanish Convivencia, and like today's cohabitation in Europe between Christian, Muslims and Jews, any ménage à trois.
I was expecting coitus interruptus.
It's mysterious, it's fascinating, but it is always very problematic. And that is why you have to resolve it anyhow, anywhere.
But Claude, you're going to get a reputation for sexual metaphors after yesterday.
I'm not endorsing that. Well, it is always problematic.
No, it's not thinking about this neighboring phase, the running motif through almost every one of the chapters is love. Or sex because so many of the conversions, for example, involve such, and so much of the rhetoric, so much of the thinking about the relationship between the faiths is articulated in that language. So it's a curious thing.
Yes, I think you will like this. You probably know the conquest chronicles of the Normans, particularly Matera, who describes how the Normans conquered Sicily and so on. Now he describes one episode where the Muslim governor of Messina betrayed the Normans and did something unworthy and so on. Now a translation of Malaterra's chronicle, which was done in the 14th century by Franciscan monk, he describes the same episode concerning this Muslim leader, but he says, and he betrayed the Normans, and then he adds, I'll say it in English, then if you want I'll say it also in Sicilian, note the proverb that says that no Jew can be a good Christian. It just slips in, although the whole story has nothing to do with Jews, but he just introduces the Jew as the epitome of betrayal and also the impossibility of really converting the Jew. There is a series of conversions of Jews at the beginning of the 14th century when Simone Valentine is Franciscan rites. We don't know exactly what were the circumstances, we just see the results. But probably the whole problem of conversion is brought to light, and he just cannot help himself. He slips the sin.
It's really interesting how...
I must add one more thing, that the translation was in the vernacular. Malaterra is written in excellent Latin, but Simone Galetti wanted to make it a more popular work, and he also omits everything to do with Southern Italy.
You know, this is another a whole other realm of conversion, which we could talk in terms of behaviors that are associated with Judaism, and to which every Christian is subject. Treason and cowardice are too. And there are many proverbs. El Victorial, I think, says there was never an act of treason that was not carried out by a Jew or his descendants. Vincent Ferrer describes how, not in a harangue about conversion, but in a harangue about feuds, he says, what is the logic by which drives people to feud? He says, well, if you don't revenge yourself, people will say to you, oh, the coward, oh, the Jew. In other words, that the taking or not taking revenge is an act of conversion between Christianity and Judaism, as sociologically perceived. And we could just, this is a beautiful, I think, example of how the category, that habit of thought, right, that kind of proverbial stereotype, cowardice is this, treason is this, gets applied, in this case, to a totally non-Jewish situation, but as meaningful expression of, well, what everybody knows, that by doing this you become, you know.
With this comment about cowardice and betrayal, we need to bring this session to an end. So please join me in thanking